Welcome back. Well, over the past few episodes, we had the opportunity to discuss what we perceive to be some of the main problems with the existing model of HDB. So the natural question many of you would have is, well, what then are your proposed solutions? So here, what we're going to do is to try to put forward some of the Workers' Party solutions to the HDB problem.
That's right. And I think we have shared some of these in the housing paper, which was published a number of years ago, and at the same time during the parliamentary debates earlier this year as well. So one of the first solutions that we have is really the universal sale and leaseback scheme. Now, what that does is really that it allows the homeowner, the HDB homeowner, to have the option to sell the flat back to the HDB. So in so doing, the HDB then becomes a buyer of last resort, and that addresses one of the key issues with the 99-year lease decay problem. And so by providing the backstop to valuations, by having the HDB being a buyer of last resort, I think that provides some stability to housing valuations.
So Louisa, hearing what you're saying about buyer of last resort and selling back to HDB, the natural question many have is, this sounds a lot like the government's existing VERS scheme. So how really is it any different?
Yes, it does sound similar, but a critical difference here is that firstly, for the universal sale and leaseback scheme, the option is really at the individual homeowner level, whereas in VERS, based on the limited information that we have, it is actually subject to voting on the precinct level, again similar to your en-bloc project that you have in the private residential properties. And at the same time, I think it's really critical that because different people have different life stages, by having the individual homeowner have the option, I think that is really the key here.
And I think it's also important to stress that this is precisely the kind of situation where you want someone like the government, which has the ability to take on the risk, to actually be the ones to take on that risk of possibly doing what they need to do with an empty flat. For instance, they may choose to rent it out in an expanded public rental scheme, or they may choose to hold it on and redevelop after they have enough of that stock. They will be the ones with the capacity to take on that risk as opposed to some individual homeowner.
So we've talked about the universal sale and leaseback scheme. So Jamus, would you like to share another suggestion that we have?
Yeah, Louis, we had already mentioned the VERS plan, but many of us would of course also be familiar with the predecessor plan for the VERS, which was in fact SERS. Now, the big difference between SERS and VERS, of course, is that SERS arguably was relatively more generous, but we appear to be at the upper end of what the government has already stated, which is that it will apply to 5% of the existing stock. So what we are suggesting is that instead we should just go ahead and do SERS for much more of the existing stock, using the existing economics that already apply to SERS, and we don't see why that might not work. What do you think, Louis, are some of the reasons why the government thinks this SERS cannot be sustainable in the medium run?
And I think that they've shared that the limit for the number of housing projects that can undergo SERS is 5%. And as far as I recall, we are already supposedly approaching the limit of 5%. But why does this has to be the case? And I think it's also something where if you look at a lot of all these SERS projects, they are the ones which are identified to have high redevelopment potential. And I think that is also where, perhaps the mature estates, that's where the projects are highly in demand by Singaporeans. And if you look at some of these older residential estates, if they are built to, let's say, 8 or 10 stories, it doesn't make sense for us to let it be the case, and you could essentially develop it with a much higher intensity, meaning to say rather than a 10-story flat, you have something which is running to 30, 40 stories. And you're already seeing this in some of the new BTO developments in Chua, for example.
So the part that is puzzling to me is, well, if you are going to have more intensive redevelopment, why is it that the economics doesn't quite work? Does it have to do with the fact that the government has perhaps trapped itself in the economics of land valuation and perhaps overvalued the land such that once you pay out that land, inevitably you would be in a loss-making position. So, but in terms of the actual economics, taking away the land, just tearing down an existing project and rebuilding it with more intensity, I'm sure the economics actually work out once you have a doubling or tripling of the floor.
Exactly, and I think this is where the government has also shared that VERS will be less generous in terms of the payments compared to SERS, and that is one of the critical differences between SERS and VERS. So the question then is, as what Jamus has already shared, why can't we then have a more widespread SERS program?
So a third suggestion that the Workers' Party has is to consider the possibility of having different kind of lease duration schemes. So right now, of course, most of us would be aware that you can purchase a flat, but ultimately it is for 99 years. There are some deviations from this. If you were to purchase, for instance, a flexi, it would be increments of 5 years, typically starting from 60 years, where you have to reach a 95-year threshold. What we're suggesting is, well, why don't we actually have the baseline be such that you start with a 70-year lease instead of a 99-year lease, and you provide the option of adding 29 years?
That's right, and I think that is something which is quite interesting, because if you look at the various property projects across Singapore, you have land leases of various tenures, industrial, for example, which is at 30 years, and there are also a 60-year assisted living project that was just introduced by the government at Perry Avenue. But I think one of the questions that people might have is, why have this option in the first place when the government already has a lease buyback scheme, since you can sell it back to the government?
So intuitively, if you think about it, how many of you would like to put an outlay of more than you actually need, rather than putting just what you need and having the option of extending it should you need more? For instance, you go for traveling, you don't imagine booking a hotel for 2 weeks when you think you'll only be there for 10 days. You'd rather book it for 10 days and then extend it by an additional 3 or 4 days should the need arise. So that's just a first intuitive reason. 70 years also really makes sense from the perspective of individuals. Most of us, should you live in the flat from the time that you acquire it till the time that you leave this earth, do live for around 70 years in that flat. So 70 years is a very natural stopping point as opposed to the additional 29 years. And then finally, I think it's worth pointing out that lower initial outlay can really make a difference. Not only from the perspective of needing to put in less in the beginning, but also because that allows CPF to accumulate over time and fulfill its original reason, rather than have it go into your flat and then feel that the flat needs to appreciate over time. I think we had mentioned earlier on that there is a conflict between the purposes of CPF and retirement adequacy versus HDB and the need to house individuals. And so this helps us to once again separate these two institutions and keep them much more aligned with their original functions.
Indeed, and I think that really addresses the two fundamental issues that people are grappling with today. Housing affordability, whereby if you can make it more affordable, why not do that? And at the same time, safeguard retirement adequacy by not maximizing the use of your CPF savings just for your primary housing.
So Louis, when I was living abroad, one of the things that I used to do was to rent. Of course, many Singaporeans have this visceral reaction when it comes to renting. They have a sense that rental is somehow lower quality. The Workers' Party has a proposal about public housing. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit more on that.
Yeah, and I think the initial reaction that a lot of people have will be renting is just throwing money down the drain. So I think that, if you look at the housing model in Singapore for the last, 60 plus years, we've been talking about home ownership being sort of like the Singapore story, the be-all and end-all when it comes to housing solutions for Singaporeans. But really, as you have personally experienced as well, renting can also be a viable form of housing arrangement for Singaporeans, and it need not be that home ownership is a superior model to renting. And I think that's something where people may be at different life stages at different points in time. I think for yourself, you were overseas, and doesn't make sense for you to commit to, let's say, a BTO flat which you will not be living in. And I think that's something which, perhaps other than home ownership per se, which we have been focusing a lot on, perhaps we can also look at renting being a much more viable form of housing arrangement where the HDB can again step up to play its role as a provider of rental housing rather than just leaving it to the private market.
Okay, but the common thinking is that, well, once you allow people to rent, they don't have a sense of ownership, they don't care for the place as much. You're going to build public slums. So what do you say to that kind of objection?
So I think it's really about putting in place protections for those who are renting, especially when the HDB itself is the landlord in play. So that's where you have some of these ugly practices of the private landlords that may not apply, and people also worry about the ability to stay for the longer term. So it need not be rents for 1 year durations, 2 year duration. It could perhaps even be a longer form of a rental duration. It could be even 5 years with the option to extend. And I think this is something, a level of flexibility that only the HDB will be able to accord rather than, say, leaving it to the private market.
And if we look at the existing options now, for instance, if you look at the flexi housing, a lot of them are smaller footprint and they in fact have shorter durations. But we don't in fact see that with this stock of housing that there's a significant difference in upkeep and maintenance and even the pride that people have in living in the medium term in these houses. So I think what really needs to happen is a bit of a mindset change among our population to accept the fact that public housing can in fact be a very viable option, a very attractive option financially, but also from a personal perspective.
And it's also encouraging to note that, especially after COVID, we have heard of a lot of Singaporeans actually going to some of these co-living operators or even exploring renting from the open market just to be able to have the space of their own, younger Singaporeans. So by allowing for a much more diversified set of housing options for our fellow Singaporeans, especially the young, I think who are much more open to such experiences of renting rather than buying per se, I think that's something we should definitely explore in the near term.
Perhaps one way to sum up all the 4 proposals that we have made is that ultimately what we want to put on the table is a greater degree of flexibility, just giving Singaporeans many more options rather than be stuck with the few cookie-cutter ones that we already have, and to push the boundaries of the existing options so that we can maximize the flexibility and hence the perceived value that Singaporeans have in their homes.
So if you want to know further about our proposals, I think we have elaborated at length about it in our housing paper, as well as in the various speeches that various MPs have put forth in the parliamentary debates earlier this year. And with that, thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks a lot.